So we've taken a couple of weeks break on Christmas Day and New Year's Day, and technically we would have finished this particular study if we did it in succession a couple of weeks ago. But I did want to finish off what we started in this study called Themes, Texts, and Traditions of Advent. And I have found it really interesting, some of the things that I've discovered. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the subject of love. We've taken a look at hope, peace, and joy, the other three qualities that are often associated in celebrating Advent. And tonight, we're going to begin with a parable, but I want to show you what we're going to start next week. So, next week, we're going to start with something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. Here is a picture of Ezekiel and his vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. And you want to talk about a weird book. The book of Ezekiel is something that is, as I'm calling it here, kind of esoteric. It's something that's strange to get our arms around and to actually understand what Ezekiel's prophecy is trying to communicate. So what I'd like to do is probably for the next few months is pick and choose a little bit out of the book of Ezekiel and let you get a feel for it. And I think one of the things that you'll discover is that it's powerful in imagery. It has a lot of interesting visionary elements to it, and maybe that's one of the reasons a lot of people find it very confusing or find it such that they don't know what to do with it. And so I'm a glutton for punishment, so I'm going to try to wade through it a little bit and figure out if it's something that we can relate to, not only from Ezekiel's day, but in our own day and age as well. So that's going to begin next Wednesday night. Tonight, I want to begin with a parable. Maybe you've heard a guy by the name of Soren Kierkegaard. He's a Danish theologian, lived in the 1800s. He was an individual that began to look at different topics of theology through a different lens sometimes than other people have looked, and he's often been called the father of existentialism. But he has some things that are very illustrative and helpful, and such is the topic for tonight, the subject of love as an Advent story. And I would want you to just kind of listen to it. You can read it online if you would like to, but I want you to listen to it because I think it does a good job of helping us with this topic tonight. It goes like this. Suppose there was a king who loved a humble maiden. The king was like no other king. Every statesman trembled before his power. No one dared breathe a word against him, for he had the strength to crush all opponents. And yet this mighty king was melted by love for a humble maiden who lived in a poor village in his kingdom. How could he declare his love for her? In an odd sort of way, his kingliness tied his hands. If he brought her to the palace and crowned her head with jewels and clothed her body in royal robes, she would surely not resist. No one dared resist him. But would she love him? She would say she loved him, of course, but would she truly? Or would she live with him in fear, nursing a private grief for the life she had left behind? Would she be happy at his side? How could he know for sure? If he rode, if he rode to her forest cottage in his royal carriage, with an armed escort waving bright banners, that too would overwhelm her. He did not want a cringing subject. He wanted a lover, an equal. He wanted her to forget that he was a king and she a humble maiden, and to let shared love cross the gulf between them. For it is only in love that the unequal can be made equal. The king, convinced he could not elevate the maiden without crushing her freedom, resolved to descend to her. Clothed as a beggar, he approached her cottage with a worn cloak fluttering loose about him. This was not just a disguise. The king took on a totally new identity. He had renounced his throne to declare his love and to win hers. Now, if this sounds a little bit familiar, it is the type of parable that really does illustrate Philippians chapter 2, where it talks about the Christ leaving behind, setting aside his privileges to become like a man. And of course, that in this parable is illustrating the ultimate expression of love. And that's going to be our topic for tonight, love. Now, that's not an easy topic to get our arms around because there's a lot of different elements of love. There's a lot of different words that are used for it as well. In the Hebrew scriptures, the word ahava is kind of like the English word for love. It can be used to express a love for a lot of different things, whether it's romantic love or a love for a particular favorite food, that type of thing. But the Hebrew word hesed is a word that is often translated loving kindness in the Old Testament, and it might more narrowly refer to the love that lowers ourselves humbly and vulnerably to lift somebody else up. And that is a common word in the Old Testament. It's often translated loyal love. It has something to do with faithfulness and loyalty, endurance, those type of things. When you get in the New Testament, there's a lot more variety. You have really four words for love. Three of them are used in the New Testament. One of them is not. We've all heard of the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. Well, it comes from the Greek word philos, which is a common form of affection between equals and brothers, that type of thing. I think we're all familiar with the word agape. This is kind of a charitable love that includes grace and mercy. Storge is another word that's kind of uh, a family type love. It can be used sometimes in negative places in the New Testament, but it's a rare usage. Then finally, eros or erotic is some of the ways we often use of love as well. Ironically enough, even though that is the fourth term that is used for love, that is never really used in the scriptures, even though I think most of us think that it is. I know for a long time, I know of phileo, I know of agape, and I always assumed eros was used in the scripture, but storge is used and eros is not. So what does that mean? When we come to the subject of love, and we try to embrace First John chapter 4 verse 16, which states the primary attribute of God is love. God is love. It's an interesting passage of scripture because it gives to us a quality about God that many times people um, assume God acts upon this type of love for other people, but the equation that is used here in First John 4:16 is more of an attribute that this is the very character of God, not just an expression. So, as we'll see in a moment, I'm going to show you a short video of Pete Enns. He talks a little bit about how, in some systems of theology, it seems as though the sovereignty of God is the dominant attribute that is often elevated. Here, though, in First John chapter 4, while it is stated that God is love, it doesn't stop there. It goes on and says this. In First John 4:7, it says, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. And whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him." There's the Soren Kierkegaard illustration. The one who is elevated, the one who is royal, has stepped into our own domain. And then he goes on and he says this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. no one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us and his love is made complete in us. And so there's this connection that love has a characteristic, an attribute of God, and he acts upon it. But the way that we know God in a loving way is how we love other people. And John in the Gospel, chapter 21, uh, kind of fleshes this out. When he meets Peter on the beach, he asked Peter 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" But what's interesting in the chapter is the different uses of love that are mentioned there. So, first off, Jesus asked Peter, "Do you agape me?" That kind of unconditional love. And Peter says, "You know, I love you, philos, phileo." In other words, he didn't use the word agape. You know, I love you. Jesus asks him a second time, "Do you agape me?" And Peter says, "You know, I phileo you." And then the third time that Peter asks, "Do you love me?" he changes the word. He says, "Do you phileo me?" And Peter says, "Oh, you know, Lord, that I phileo you." And Jesus says, "Then feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Love other people in the way you say you love me." Now, what's interesting here, I think, is Jesus accommodates the type of love that Peter can give in that moment. He doesn't dare use the word agape because he's already denied the Lord 3 times, right? He's carrying some shame. He's carrying some guilt. He's possibly doesn't want to extend another foot in his mouth type thing. But Jesus meets him right where he is. And he says, "I'm willing to love, let you use the love that you have just the way you are. Feed my sheep, feed my sheep." And so in Advent, when we are waiting on hope and peace and joy and love, God is willing to meet us where we are and allow us to continue to move closer to the type of love that is expressed in God's attribute, the agape type of love. So, this is an interesting dynamic. It is something that we find um, especially during the Advent season. We say we are pursuing peace, we say we are embracing joy, we say we want hope and love one another, is a part of the theme. But what we find is that do we act upon it appropriately right where we are with the type of love that we have? And, if we took some of the other teachings of Jesus, he will even say things like, love your enemies, um, you know, go the extra mile, that type of thing. So that's really the theme that I wanted to talk about tonight. And then the second element that we've been using on Wednesday night is texts. Now, here's an interesting thing that I did not show you in our previous studies. It kind of goes back a few weeks, but when we talked a little bit about Mary's Magnificat, I mentioned that it's very similar to the prayer that is found in Hannah, and that's found in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. So I thought I'd stick that in for our text portion tonight. And you can see the similarities. Actually, there's 8 similarities between Mary and Hannah. So if you're reminded of the story of 1 Samuel chapter 2, you know that Hannah had been praying for a son, and finally, when she does have Samuel, she dedicates him to the Lord, and Samuel will be found in the temple, and he will serve the Lord within the temple area. And so, what we find is that Mary is going to kind of copycat the expressions of Hannah. And it resonates with her heart so much that you find the themes that kind of come alongside what you find in First Samuel. So here's what I mean by this. Here's the here's the illustration. here, and I did not send this to you, but you can find it online. It's easy enough to Google. But if you look down the left column, you'll find in First Samuel chapter 2, this is how it reads. You can see that's pretty sequential. There's a few verses that are missing, but I'm going to read it, and then I'll read some of the spotty elements in Luke's account of Mary's Magnificat. So in 1 Samuel 2, it says, and Hannah prayed and said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. For no one is holy like the Lord, for there is none beside you, nor is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth, for the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, and the hungry have ceased to hunger. He will guard the feet of his saints, but the wicked shall be silent in darkness. For by strength no man shall prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to the king and exalt the horn of his anointed. So there's some elements of what Hannah sung in response to the child of Samuel. Now, listen and watch closely the similarities that are found in Mary's Magnificat. In Luke chapter 1, we read, and Mary said, my soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoiced in God my Savior. For he who is mighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and his mercy is on those who fear him from generation to generation. And he has put down the mighty from their thrones, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham and his seed forever. So if you were to just take each of these verses and kind of read one, and then the other, you would find these similarities of themes, and it's almost like a New Testament repetition of what is found in the Old Testament with the themes and the various things that are there. So let me go back here for a moment. When you look at those two songs, one of the things we are going to find is that Luke is intensifying the connection between Hannah and Mary by mimicking the literary structure that is found in Samuel. And as Hannah's prayer kind of foreshadows the actions that follow in 1st and 2nd Samuel, really the prayer of Mary, the Song of Mary, kind of anticipates what is going to follow in the Gospel of Luke. Her descriptions of God, like filling the hungry and sending the rich away empty, kind of play out in the earthly ministry of Jesus. And what we find is eventually Jesus will give his Sermon on the Plain. In Matthew, it's the Sermon on the Mount, but in Luke, it's the Sermon on a Level Plain. This is an interesting contrast. This particular teaching is not as long as Matthew's account. Could have been a repeated thing that he did, or it could be simply Luke is summarizing it in a different format. So just as Mary prophesies about God's kingdom belonging to the poor and the hungry, the wealthy and the well-fed will find it hard to understand this type of kingdom because it's upside down from the way the world usually works. So with that in mind, the text really is paralleling the two women, learning a lot about God and his love for people, his love for especially those on the lower levels of societal needs and that type of thing. And um, so Mary's song kind of prepares us for a new kind of king that is exalted after he has experienced his own humility and humiliation. And both the ministry of Jesus and the death of Jesus will illustrate kind of the ethics of God's kingdom, how his character works, how his love is expressed. And so Mary's surrender will be the preview of the surrender of Jesus to the will of God, this God of love that is showing future generations what love of God and what love of neighbor looks like. So I hope that helps a little bit here. That, when we talk a little bit about love and what it means and so forth, if you use Hannah's song, if you use Mary's song, it illustrates how God fleshes out his love on the earthly level. So, do you have any questions or comments there before we go on to the next slide? Anything? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch just a short little video of Pete Enns, and he talks about love as well. And so we'll then come to the tradition side of things after this video. Let's watch.
30 years ago, a theologian named William Platcher, who has since passed away, he wrote a book, it was exactly 30 years ago, called Narratives of a Vulnerable God. And as I mentioned, he's a Calvinist, and the Calvinist tradition, more than any other, says that God's primary characteristic is God's sovereignty. And the Calvinist tradition has gotten a lot of mileage out of that. But Placer himself, being a Calvinist, says, no, it's not sovereignty, it's God's vulnerability. And this is what happens when you have a God who is a God of love. Love means being vulnerable, and God's vulnerability is seen in God's participation in the narratives of humanity. And being in a covenant relationship with Israel, for example, and in the Christian faith, it is in God becoming one of us and then participating in the shameful death of crucifixion. We just jumped from Easter from Christmas to Easter pretty quickly. Anyway, I hold on to that thought when I read this book a few years ago, and I thought to myself, goodness gracious, I hope he's right, and I think that he is. If this isn't about love, if Christmas isn't about a message of love from God to humanity, then what is it? It's not worth anything to me. And love is something that changes you. You know, when you're in a loving relationship with someone, both parties are changed. And many theologians of the process theology variety will argue that if God is love, God has to be in a state of vulnerability and even in a state of change. Because what does love do if not change the parties involved? If people in relationship will change each other, people in a loving relationship will change each other. That's a lot to explore. I don't mean to do that in this little video, but the idea is just intriguing to me that if God is love, then, what kind of a God is like that? It's not one that you would dream up on your own. I think this is a divine move, that God is love and God shows love to humanity in many ways, one of which is the gift of his son at Christmas time itself. So as far as I'm concerned, if this isn't about love, it's about nothing, and nothing else matters. And I try to keep that in mind also during the Christmas season. We have hope, we have peace, and we have joy. But to paraphrase Paul, the greatest of these is love.
Okay, so we have just taken a look at that video, and we're going to come to the last tradition. We've been exploring some traditions from around the world that are enacted during the Advent season. And tonight I want to talk about Epiphany. So, this past Sunday, uh, we talked a little bit about the Magi, and ironically enough, we had some technical problems on Sunday. So unfortunately, if you weren't there, you can't find it online because it didn't record. So, anyways, but a quick summary that from Sunday's message is that we were talking a little bit out of Matthew chapter 2, and it's possibly a year or two passed by, and there's a group of people that come seeking the newborn king, Jesus. And they come to the place that seems to be the most logical place to find a newborn king. They come to Herod, who is the current ruler. They probably think that if this star that they see in the sky represents a new royalty that has come to pass, then where else would you find royalty but in the royal court? And so they go to Herod and they said, where is this newborn king? And of course, Herod is paranoid. Herod sees this as a threat. And the group of individuals that come are known as magi. It's interesting that we give them other names, wise men. Sometimes we call them kings, but they are Eastern astrologers. More than likely, they are of the Zoroastrian religion. They use astrology. They use astronomy. They use a lot of what we might consider the magic of its day. In the Old Testament, the word that is used to describe that are the people that Nebuchadnezzar uh, leans into to try to interpret the dreams that he's having and is troubling him. But the word magoi in Greek uh, indicates a group of individuals that come seeking this newborn king that follows a star, which is interesting. This star, we don't really know what it is. Um, is it a special star? Is it something that um, it seems as though it's something that it is unusual for these individuals to follow. And you can imagine the amount of preparation and finances it would take for it to travel over 600 miles from Persia into Judea. And you have to think a little bit about the courage it took as well to move into that territory. They were looking for a new way of existence, much like a lot of the people that are being occupied by the Roman Empire. But this event has come to be known as Epiphany, and it's celebrated on January 6th, which is the 12th day of Christmas. Um, we mentioned a few weeks ago that we tend to wind down on Christmas, the day after Christmas, December the 23rd. But in the early church, it's only gearing up. For Christmastide is a 12-day period that has a lot of different traditions associated with it. This one, Epiphany, has the idea not just of magi that are seeking the newborn king, but what is being manifested through the appearance of God in the person of a newborn baby and the star that led the way. And so the word epiphany means a manifestation or a revelation or an appearance or vision of God. And the word epiphany is celebrating more than the birth of Christ. In the history of the early church, it's the celebration of the divinity of Christ. Now, It kind of goes in two different directions, though. As you know, if you know a little bit about church history, early on, the early church divides between the Eastern and the Western churches. They have two different capitals, Constantinople in the east and Rome in the west. And they have two different sets of bishops and leadership and so on and so forth. Well, they also have different traditions as well. Epiphany is a feast, much like many of the other feasts that we were talking about. And if you missed some of that, we talked a lot about some of the different feasts that are celebrated during this Christmas tide period. But this one, as you'll see in a moment, is really, really popular around the world. And it takes on kind of different shades of meaning depending upon where you find it being celebrated. So, as early as the third century, the eastern side of the church viewed it not so much about the birth of Christ, but about the manifestation of God to mankind. In the fourth century, or toward the end of the fourth century, the feast became known and celebrated in the West more about the birth of Christ because of the appearance of these magi or wise men. And so they kind of take different directions. Um, it's not until really the Middle Ages that the idea of the kings is attached to this group of people. And why the Middle Ages? Because that's the cultural setup of that day. You had a king and you had servants and all that type of thing. But in the original episode, these are not kings. These are not kings. However, that term is attached to the Epiphany event and it's used around the world. So in the West, the church celebrates Christ's birth on December the 25th, and it's really associated with the humility of Christ in a manger or the poverty of Mary and Joseph, seeking the one who is born either in a home or a cave. And in that crib of poverty, shepherds come and offer their humble worship. And crunching together the magi, they often appear in nativity sets as well. However, we know by the edict that Herod will issue that he wants all boys 2 years and younger to be killed, that there's been some time that has passed. So our nativity sets are not accurate historically, but they help kind of bring the big picture together. And so use those nativity sets. They're beautiful. Um, the purpose of the Feast of Epiphany was to kind of reinforce God's manifestation to a group of pagans, really. These are not Christians. They are foreigners. They're probably, as I mentioned a moment ago, Zoroastrian in their religious beliefs. But there is attached to Epiphany. This is what's interesting. If you continue reading in Matthew chapter 2 and go into chapter 3, John the Baptist becomes the predecessor of Jesus, and he is the voice in the wilderness leading the way. Then, when you get to chapter 4, you find the baptism of Christ and the temptation of Christ. And in so doing, this tradition of Epiphany celebrates also the baptism of Christ in the Jordan River and even the first miracle of Jesus, changing water to wine at the marriage feast in Cana. And so you get again this crunching together of events. And in around the world, there are different elements associated with the Feast of Epiphany. Now, a lot of different interpretations are often attached to it. So when you read the Matthew account, the Magi show up and they carry with them three precious commodities: gold, incense, and myrrh, or another word for incense is frankincense. The gold represents probably kingly power. The frankincense is a specialized incense that was used in the temple, and it was considered a commodity that was not to be purchased on the street. It was to be offered up to God as a sweet aroma of worship, and so it's a unique blend. Myrrh is an interesting thing. That was what was often used for embalming, in the sense of preparing the body for burial. So you have gold, kingly power, you have frankincense, kind of representing the ministry of the high priest, and then you have this idea of the burial of Christ, that he would eventually be crucified. So Epiphany often around the world celebrates the threefold ministry of Christ, his kingship, his priesthood, and his manhood, that he is one of us. So let me bring you back up here for a second and see if you have some thoughts or questions before we get into some of the differences around the world and stuff and how they celebrate it. But any thoughts or questions about that? No?
How does the Epiphany fit with the Eastern Orthodox calendar?
The calendar element of it, it is really kind of the end of Christmas tide, but it is also the celebration as it was yesterday Orthodox Christianity was Christmas in Orthodox religion. Now, one thing I don't know, and I'd have to look this up, there might be a calendar difference, using a different calendar as well between the Eastern and the Western churches.
But it's in the Eastern, it's also 12 days after.
Mm-hmm.
So Epiphany hasn't happened yet in the Eastern.
No. And so in the Eastern, that's why Christmas goes all the way toward the end of January, the beginning of February. That is correct.
Okay.
So, which is interesting because you can almost see in neighborhoods when you drive through, some people start taking down their Christmas decorations the day after Christmas. Other people like us will leave it up through, the first part of January. But you see other people that keep it up all the way through to the end of January. And you kind of wonder whether their religious tradition is such that it's maybe more Orthodox than it is Western in nature. So hopefully that makes sense. But all right, so I'm going to give you some illustrations of how different parts of the world celebrate the Feast of Epiphany. And here are some of the ways different countries and cultures celebrate it. So there are some commonalities. There usually is greenery and nativity sets and that type of thing. That's common. But in your question, Esty, is referred in reference to Candlemas, which finishes on February the 2nd. So there, that kind of ties in with the question that you just had. So in countries that are kind of shaped by Western Christianity, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, a lot of the customs associated with the Feast of Epiphany usually include things like pastries, those type of things that bring the Christmas season to a close. But in Orthodox countries, Eastern side of the church, there is also baptismal rites and house blessings that are associated with Epiphany. So now we kind of see it kind of goes in different directions between the East and the West. So let me give you just some examples. So in Greece, you have the feast called the Theophany of Phota. Okay, and you probably will recognize the word phota. It's the idea of lights. Photography comes from that. When there is this idea of a long procession that leads to a body of water, which is interesting. Of course, Greece being an island, people can celebrate it all around the island in one form or another. And they would carry sacred icons, and there would be priests and musicians that kind of lead the way to the waters. And there, the community would jump into the water to retrieve a ceremonial cross. And whoever finds this cross in the icy waters at that time uh, supposedly have luck for the rest of the year. Isn't that interesting? So the water is associated with baptism of Christ, but it is also this idea of purification, which originally, as you know, in Hebrew, mikvah or ceremonial washings is this idea of purification. So you do have some connection to that as well. Now you come a little bit farther west to Spain or even Latin American countries. Here's where the names of kings begin to be attached to the Feast of Epiphany. Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthasar. They supposedly are representative of three areas that could be traveled to by these magi to Bethlehem. And by now, though, if time has gone by, Mary and Joseph, after they're probably not necessarily in Bethlehem. Maybe they had to seek him someplace else. But let's, for the sake of making it simple, that they're still in Bethlehem. Maybe they're still with family. And what we find is some time has passed by. Mary and Joseph have not fled to Egypt yet to escape the edict of Herod. But the tradition in Latin American countries is that these three kings represent different geographical areas: Arabia, the Orient, and Africa. They represent three different types of animals that they use to travel: horse, camel, and elephant. And they bring three types of gifts: gold, incense, and myrrh. Now, you say, where do they get this? It's just tradition. You can't turn to chapter and verse of any of this in the Bible. Different traditions take on different directions. So, what do Spanish children do? Well, on the eve of January the 6th, Spanish children will polish their shoes, and they will get them ready for the king's presents to be put in them. So, we see similarities with stockings, right? In the West, we put stockings up, and Santa Claus is going to come and put something in the stocking. When they get up the next morning, they find that there are presents in their shoes. But one similarity between the East and the West is, have you been naughty or nice? Naughty kids get a lump of coal. Nice kids get presents. Well, the lump of coal in Spanish countries is a hard sugar candy that is dyed black. It has a name for it too, carbon dulce. So they're celebrating different than Greece. Well, Germans, they call it Three Kings Day. So they're carrying out this tradition. Don't ask me to pronounce this word. I don't know if you can, SD. Can you pronounce this word? No, I don't even know how to pronounce it. But it is a public holiday in and around that area: Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And they eat what is called a Three Kings cake, which is a golden pastry ring filled with orange and spice, which is supposed to be representative of gold and incense and myrrh. Now, there's even a little bit of difference between those countries. So in Switzerland, they make the cakes look like a crown. They use seven large buns in a round pan, and it's topped with some type of pearl sugar. The dough is part of challah bread and some other things as well. These type of things are purchased in bakeries. So we see this type of mentality um, come into our own culture. The idea of kings, cakes, and stuff. Where do we see it? Right before Lent starts, right? You see, what are those things called in the grocery store? I'm drawing a blank. Right before Lent starts, you have Carnival, which is the parade down in New Orleans, and the kings. Uh, Giant Eagle makes them every year. I'm drawing a blank. But there you have kind of a similarity even in our own culture as well. England celebrates Epiphany on the 12th night, the first night of Christmas being December 25th and 26th, and the 12th night being the 5th and 6th of January. So the English usually celebrate Epiphany with their own special cake, and that is fruit cake or dense fruit cakes. Now, sometimes that's given uh, at Christmas time as well. You can find that as in stores as well. These are all connections in in different ways. Different traditions have developed over the feast of Epiphany. In in Europe, often there is a bean that is put in some of the types of pastries as kind of a way, if a person finds that, supposedly they get good luck for the next year, that type of thing. They often are more spicy foods, ginger snaps and spiced ale, and it kind of is supposed to symbolize the costly spices that the Magi, or as they call them, the three wise men or three kings, brought to Jesus. Egypt. So you go south and you find Epiphany is celebrated in the Orthodox Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church. Their calendar is a bit different. On the 11th of Tov of the Coptic calendar. It represents the baptism of Jesus when the skies open up and God says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." So there's an epiphany or manifestation of God through the baptism of Christ. But now this is what's interesting. Um, you find that Epiphany is one of the seven great feasts of the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt. And it's a day of strict fasting. So all these other countries are baking special types of things and enjoying it. Well, this is more of a sacred day, a day for baptism, a day for fasting, that type of thing. So they take it in a different direction. In France, since the Middle Ages, they also make king's cakes. It's round, flat, gold cake made of puff pastry, and they celebrate again the crown element of this particular feast. And um, you can see in the last point here, this the person who gets a piece of cake with a charm in it, that's a similarity, becomes the king or queen for the day, and they wear a gold paper crown. Now, we were celebrating Christmas um, with mom down at the nursing home, and Esty got at the store those popper things that you pull and they pop out, and in in each one of those was what? A paper crown that you put on. So there's these similarity type things that are in close proximity, England and France, that type of thing. The person who gets the charm has the obligation to offer a beverage to everyone around the table, which is usually wine or champagne. And they are supposed to volunteer the next year to host that celebration in their home. So isn't this fascinating? Just the way different ways different people have celebrated. The Irish in Ireland call the Feast of Epiphany Little Christmas or Women's Christmas. That's an interesting dynamic because it's on this day women are traditionally they rest and celebrate their holiday after cooking and cleaning and all the hard work of the Christmas holidays. So typically women will dine at a restaurant or gather in a pub for the evening, and they receive gifts from children and grandchildren and other members of the family as a way of expressing their appreciation for all the hard work that they did over the Christmas holidays. They had some other things that are attached to it. They burned sprigs of Christmas holly in the fireplace that was used for decorations in the home during the Christmas season. In Italy, Epiphany is associated with a figure. Befana, which maybe you've seen pictures of a broomstick riding old woman that comes on in the night between January 5th and 6th and brings gifts to children, a lump of coal to the naughty kids who have misbehaved, and gifts to the nice kids. Mexico celebrates it on January the 5th, and traditionally, just like the other Latin American countries, it's not Santa Claus necessarily, but the three kings who are the bearers of the gifts, leaves them in or near their shoes and that type of thing. Poland has huge parades. They welcome the wise men. They ride a lot of animals, camels, or they will bring out animals from the zoo. These processions, the wise men hand out candy and sweets, and they sing. They have live nativities that are enacted on the Feast of Epiphany. And when they get back home, they inscribe KMB somewhere in their home because it represents the three names associated with the three kings, Caspar, Melchior, and Belshazzar. Um, and then that becomes kind of a symbol of wanting Christ to bless their house for the next year. Um, that remains on the door all year long. KMB, and if it gets inadvertently dusted off or replaced, they put it back on the next year. So there's some elements of superstition there as well, sort of like some people like to have a statue of Saint Joseph in their home because they think it will bring protection and good luck. In Russia, Epiphany is celebrated on January 19th. And once again, you have the marks of baptism associated with it. In the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, you have the great blessing of the waters. And they believe on this day the water becomes holy, that it contains some type of special powers that will bless people. So a lot of times Russians will cut holes in the ice that's on the lakes and rivers in the shape of a cross. And then they will dip into that freezing water. And again, it's kind of an act of repentance and sanctification, that type of thing. And it's supposedly washing away their sins from the past year, kind of a renewal, if you will. So those are just some examples of that. But a lot of times there's been epiphany wishes that are associated with some of these things. You find here some of the things that people will put in cards or whatever over Epiphany. May the wisdom of the Magi guide you. May the Epiphany remind us of the good news of Christ. God reveals himself in many ways. May he show himself to you this Epiphany. May God speak to you through Epiphany. May God reveal himself through your actions. May Epiphany bring you the light of Christ. May it bring you wisdom and kindness and grace. A lot of these things are become kind of the cultural expressions during this period of time. You know, so a lot of times when we write out, or when we used to write out Christmas cards, we might have, you know, may the may this season of the year bring you peace or something like that. Well, these are some of the things that you find. So, anyways, that's going to close off our study of Advent, and we stretched it out with a couple of breaks over Christmas and New Year's. But are there some things that maybe you would have liked to ask during this study that you want to ask, or can I clarify anything before we finish off this study tonight? Anything on your mind? It's a quite fascinating period of time in the calendar year. And depending upon where you go, if you have the privilege of being someplace else over Christmas, you'll find that they will celebrate it in unique and wonderful ways. So, just kind of keep that in mind and keep your eye open for some of these little things that we've talked about over the past several weeks. So anything else before we say goodnight? No? Okay. All right, then I'll say goodnight and we'll see you next week, okay?
Thanks,
Night,
Larry.
Larry. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
You're
Thanks a
welcome.
lot.
Good
Bye,
night.
guys.